There's a theme that runs throughout the Bible regarding the feasts of God, and this theme answers the question, why are we here? Many years ago, when I started keeping the biblical feasts, the opening message often resonated with this question, why are we here? And then we turn to the outline of the biblical feasts that are in Leviticus 23, and it gives us a list. And I want to approach this question, why are we here, with a different emphasis than perhaps we've focused on earlier. And I want to use three words to help us to better understand why we're here. One is desire, the second is relief, and the third is rejoice. Desire, relief, and rejoice are all remarkable words, and all of these words are related to motivation. These three words, desire, relief, and rejoice, describe our motivation, what makes us do things. Sometimes we're motivated by desire, an intense feeling of need or want for something, like food cravings are an example are an example of a common desire. Now, I like chocolate dipped almonds, okay? And every once in a while, I get this strong desire to go look for them, to find them. Oh, and I think I know where I might find them. And if the store doesn't have them, I'm disappointed. But if I get those chocolate-dipped almonds, well, then I'm relieved. It's going to satisfy my need. And so I have the desire. I found them, so I'm relieved. And when I start nibbling on those, I have to put limits. Because that's the part when I'm digging in and I can rejoice. Oh, yes, these are good. I really like these. And I might do this again sometime. Well, so sometimes we're motivated by desire that we want very much. Sometimes we're motivated by desire to avoid some bad thing, and that's a motivator. The desire may be a little thing or a big thing, but desire does power our actions. Sometimes we're motivated by relief. We're simply glad to be out of a bad situation, and we're pleased or relieved that a problem or responsibility, relieved from it, or something that we didn't want. Winston Churchill was the prime minister, as a young man, as a future prime minister of Great Britain. He was a soldier during the Boer Wars in South Africa. In his biography, he wrote about his wartime experiences as a young man. And the context of the story was he was running away from a battle in an attempt to save his life. Well, here he is a long way from home. England's a long way from South Africa. And he's trying to survive in a war situation. And Churchill made this observation, and I'm going to paraphrase what he wrote. There is nothing quite so stimulating or thrilling as when the enemy has done his best to kill you and missed. Well, Churchill was motivated by the desire to stay alive. He was then relieved to have escaped the battle with his life, and then later he rejoiced in the wisdom that he gained from that experience. What keeps us when we're on the highway from speeding, going over the limit, when we drive our car on the highway? Is it a genuine desire to follow the law, or is it out of fear of the consequences of getting caught if we drive too fast? Is our motivation, what is the motivation? Or is the motivating factor that causes us to drive is to be safe? So we're safe and everybody else around us is safe because we don't want anything bad to happen to us or someone else. Well, we look at what motivates us each day. What now motivates us to observe these days of unleavened bread? Well, the first instruction to the nation of Israel to keep the days of unleavened bread is in Exodus 12, starting in verse 14. In Exodus 12:14, and runs through verse 20, and it starts out, this day shall be a memorial to you, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Did it say you just keep it this one shot and that's good? And it says, follows up, you shall keep it as an everlasting ordinance. How long is everlasting? It's forever. it says, and then it goes on, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. The first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh, that person shall be cut off from Israel. In other words, out of the fellowship. On the first day, verse 16, there shall be a holy convocation. And on the seventh day, there shall be a holy convocation. A convocation means a convoking, a bringing together. And we're all here because this is a convocation. It's a bringing together. And again, in verse 17 ends with, you shall observe this throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. And then it repeats some of these instructions about how we are not, just not that we eat unleavened bread, but we don't eat leavened products, and we don't have them in our houses. Now, as we heard in the sermonette, the listing of biblical annual holy days appears in Leviticus 23, and it starts out with the feast of the Lord. It says these are. What's the first one? The seventh-day Sabbath. Every week we have that, and then it follows that up with the annual Sabbath, which is the first holy day, is actually the first day of unleavened bread. It's the feast of the Lord. It doesn't say feast of the Jews. It doesn't say feast of Ralph, Herbert, Henry, or Tim. No, it's the feast of the Lord. Now, 14 times I look through in my Bible says there are direct instructions for these words for us to keep 7 days of unleavened bread. So we want to follow God, so we desire to keep the feast. We rejoice when we do keep the feast. And that idea of rejoicing is it's an uplifting celebration. In Isaiah 62:5, we read, and the bridegroom rejoices over his bride. He's really anticipating, and now the wedding comes. It says, so shall God rejoice over you. So it's an uplifting, enjoyable opportunity. You know, it only takes 2 people for a wedding. You may have heard that. It's a willing bride and an anxious mother. Because if you have a willing bride and an anxious mother, there's going to be a wedding, because men are so predictably easy. All they do is just flash a little ankle, bat some eyelashes, and men will fall in line like ox to slaughter. So in Isaiah 62, a bridegroom rejoices in delight when he finds his bride. Well, the bride also rejoices on her wedding day. She spends her time making ready for the marriage. And so the church also is looking forward, prepares itself for the return of Christ to earth. And the wedding party and everybody involved is excited about that potential. So God rejoices when we come to join his family. And it's something we look forward to. So desire is a good thing. And then when that comes to pass, the rejoicing is a delightful thing as well. In Acts 18:21, we read about the Apostle Paul was very desirous of going to Jerusalem to keep the spring feast, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. When he was leaving Ephesus in Acts 18:21, that was his desire. He was going to pursue that. Now, as we know, the word desire is often linked to food and taste. In Psalm 34, verse 8, O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. There is a desire that's within us. Now, we all have some favorite foods, of course, so we can relate to that about tasting and seeing. In other words, it's delightful. We like that. It's a desire. And these days of unleavened bread are a treat to those who truly love God and keep his commandments. Now, we like to hear encouraging words when we meet, like chocolate and things like that. I remember going to grad school many years ago, and I noticed in one of the classes there was this lady who was going to class. She was about 40, and every day she would come to class and eat chocolate all semester long. And I just asked her one day, I said, well, you know, how often do you eat chocolate? I mean, the class was like 3 times a week. And she looked at me as if I had just landed from Mars and said, well, every day, of course. You know, that was her. She loved her chocolate. Now, if we turn to Proverbs 16 and verse 24, Proverbs 16:24, when we come together, we want to hear encouraging words. And in Proverbs 16:24, pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. Makes you feel good when you hear those affirming words. In fact, it's one of the love languages that they have since discovered is words of affirmation. Everybody likes to hear that. And so when we come together, as we do on the first and seventh day convocations of the Days of Unleavened Bread, we have that opportunity to encourage and uplift each other with positive words. Now, we've discussed three words: desire, or wish to have, or do something that we really like. We've looked at relief, the feeling of comfort when something bad doesn't happen, or rejoice, that celebration when desire is accomplished or relief is granted. Well, about 25 years ago, one of my daughters asked this question: Why do we have 7 days of unleavened bread? I thought it was a good question because other holy days could be one day. We don't want 7 days of fasting in the fall for a Day of Atonement, but other days, holy days, are often one. But here we have a whole week. And she goes, why do we have to do this for 7 days? Well, I want to start and look back in the book of Hebrews and Hebrews 11, verse 30, and go back and explain the circumstances of 7 days of unleavened bread. In Hebrews 11, verse 30, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encompassed about for 7 days. Well, the answer to the question why we have unleavened bread for 7 days, we're going to look at that time when Joshua and the children of Israel entered the promised land and the ensuing battle of the city of Jericho. Now, according to the Jewish historian Josephus, in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, the 7th day of unleavened bread is the anniversary of the fall of the city of Jericho. And when you examine the situation around the fall of Jericho, will help us understand why there are 7 days of unleavened bread. And the biblical story of this, that unfolds from the book of Genesis through the book of Exodus, about the people of Israel, the children of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, had migrated to Egypt. They stayed for generations, and they were eventually enslaved by the Egyptians. And the story of Exodus, then, is how God used Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt through the Red Sea to safety. And this Exodus is where prior to this Exodus is where the first Passover occurred. And then on the night of departure, the night to be much remembered as they were celebrating and leaving Egypt. And then we read about these days of unleavened bread. It's the first record of it in that story. And the story continues in the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, how the Israelites were afraid then to follow through and continue on to the promised land. They went close, but they were afraid because there were giants in the land. There were huge obstacles that they were fearful of. And so, as a result, they turned down God's offer to secure the promised land for them. And then they wound up in the wilderness for 40 years because all of the people who had come out of Egypt, except for Joshua and Caleb, all of those who were over 20 at the time, then died in the wilderness. All of those who passed through the Red Sea, and 40 years is a long time in the wilderness. I think about that, living in the house. What if I had to live in the woods for 40 years? Or out on a field somewhere, with a flimsy tent. You still had livestock to care for. And I think of, little things like lack of running water, no toilet tissue, and a whole lot of other things that come to mind that make life hard in the wilderness. Well, I want to then go through pick up this story because it starts over in the book of Joshua. And if we look at the actual history before the battle for the city of Jericho, we read about the children of Israel the new generation had to be cleaned up before going into the promised land. the land of Canaan, which was the land that they had waited for all their lives. And so the parents had died in the wilderness, waiting to inherit the promised land, and now it was about to happen. And as we go through this story, we're going to see some points jump out to us. Now, recently we covered the subject of what God instructed Joshua about him before the children of Israel went into the promised land, and in the last few weeks. And we covered Joshua chapter 1 and verses 6, 7, and 8. And those 3 verses gave us 12 instructions to Joshua. They're just as applicable to us today. In verse 6, Joshua was told, be strong, meaning be strong in the faith. Secondly, he told Joshua to be courageous, to set aside our fears and our worries on God, give our worries to God. The third thing he said, God told Joshua, you will lead these people, meaning, and the same with us, we're to be a witness to the world. We are to be a leader in that sense. The fourth thing was to inherit the land that God swore to their ancestors to give to them. And it's really the picture of the future kingdom of God is coming. The fifth lesson is in verse 7, be strong and very courageous. It's this repetition of strong and courageous, but the addition of the word very. It's not just casual, it's intense. Point 7 was to be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. You see, God's law is timeless. It's true no matter whether we're young or whether we're old, whether we're home or whether we're somewhere else. It's our job to focus on God's law. The 7th point was don't turn to it, meaning the law, from the right or the left. Meaning there is a right, there is a wrong, and it's not the world. We cannot pretend it's all squishy and gray because there is a right and a wrong. Point 8, you may be successful wherever you go. Well, that's pretty good. God has promised blessings for us when we do what he wants us to do. Point 9 in these verses is in verse 8, keep this book of the law always on your lips, which means we should not be shy about letting God's laws guard our lips and guide our words. And sometimes guarding our lips and guiding our words means we keep our mouth shut at the right time, and then we open it up at the right time elsewhere. So we need discernment. If we look on point 10 in verse 8, it's meditate on it, meaning the law day and night. God's law should be on our minds and directing our thoughts. We should be continually thankful for the blessings of God's law. Point 11, that you may be careful to do everything written in it. You see, careful in the small things will demonstrate that we can be trusted to be careful in the big things. And the final one, point 12, is you shall be prosperous and successful. Again, a repetition, that God will fulfill his promises to us. He will complete his end of the covenant, his end of the bargain, if we do what God expects of us. And that's really a summary of the instructions to Joshua. And we pick it up now for the next, as we prepare now and go into the promised land or follow what the children of Israel do, stepping into it. Now, in order to get into the promised land, they have to cross the Jordan River. They're on the west side of the Jordan River in order to go into the land of Canaan, which is the promised land. And they know that their parents told them that's where the giants are, all kinds of bad things, fearful things. And their parents died in the wilderness. They were afraid that 40 years before. So what we're looking at here at this point is, and point 1 in this scenario is people were had to go over the Jordan River. But remarkably, in Joshua 3 and verse 13, the Jordan River was stopped up like the Red Sea, so that the people could cross over that. And that was just like when the people of Israel left Egypt, it was a type of baptism when they walk across the Red Sea. Here, there was for the next generation, there was a type of baptism when they were going to cross the Jordan River. And if we read in Joshua 3:13, it will come to pass as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, and the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from the waters that come above, and they shall stand in a heap. Whoa, how'd you like to be standing there watching that? The waters were stopped up. The water of the Jordan River stopped so that the priests could carry the Ark of the Covenant across the river. And the Ark of the Covenant was to go first when the priests took it. Now, if we were to come up to a river, and the moment we stepped toward the water, all of a sudden the water piled up, stopped flowing, the land was dry in front of us, we would be somewhat amazed, I rather suspect. And I don't know how many of you have been to Universal Studios in the Los Angeles area. And if you've seen the setting where they did the movie The Ten Commandments, and I managed to ride through that, they have a little rail car that goes through that will take you through that. Now, it's a miniature version of what the real thing would be like, but with cameras, you can make it look big, of course, as they did in the movie. And we take this little rail car, and it looks like it's going to go right into the water, just a little like a golf cart. And you go through it, and then the walls come back. So you can see the water pouring down, but it's not engulfing us. And it's really a miniaturized version of the real thing. And you go, whoa. So it had to be way more dramatic in real life when the water was stopped up. And now it happened again on the Jordan River. Well, the Ark of the Covenant was a special box that was made, and this box had handles on it that contained the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. And biblical historians will tell you that the Ark of the Covenant contained the rod of Aaron. And if we study that, the rod of Aaron budded with and produced almonds, which had to be a miracle. When it was thrown down in front of Pharaoh, Aaron's rod turned into a serpent that gobbled up the pagan priest snakes, and then it became a rod again. And that was in the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark also contained a container of manna. How the children of Israel lived for 40 years was a staple of manna. So the Ark is being carried forward with these items in it. And it's a reminder of the miracles of God and the law of God that they were to carry with them wherever they went. In Joshua 3, in verse 15, Joshua 3:15, and they that bear the ark were to come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests that bear the ark were dipped into the brim of the water. And then it's interesting. And the Jordan overflowed all its banks at the time of harvest. It was overflowing. What are you, some kind of nut crossing a river that's flooded over its banks? I mean, that's what you would have to think, right? But then in verse 16, the waters stood up, and in a heap, and those, and if we read then in verse 17, the priests that bear the Ark of the Covenant stood on firm, dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all the Israelites passed over on dry ground until all the people were passed over. So not only was stopped up, it was dry enough. Otherwise, you just have mud, and it'd go, muddled up there. So there could be as many as 2 million people who came out of Egypt. However many they reproduced, and some died in the wilderness. There were a lot of people crossing over the Jordan with dry feet. That we read in Joshua 4:18. So it wasn't just the Red Sea that was backed up. It was some 40 years before, but now it was the Jordan River. Now, what do you think the locals thought about that? The people that lived on both sides of the river, of the Jordan River. And we read in Joshua 5 and verse 1, we read what the locals thought. In Joshua 5:1, so when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, meaning on the east side of the Jordan, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel, their hearts melted. Ever have a sad, sick feeling that things aren't going to go well for you? That, oh no. Well, it says their hearts melted. There was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. Like, what's going on here? This is supernatural. And their fears were intense. Now, do you suppose some of the local people developed some fear of God, of these Israelites that had been living off in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they're coming across the Jordan? Well, the local peoples, they worship pagan gods, and they didn't worship the true God. And each local kingdom, area, or people, they had their own God to worship. So in other words, each local one had their own, they attended to the locals, so they figured that the Israelites had their own local God, only it looked like their local God was way more powerful than theirs, so they struck fear into them. So step one was the people crossed over, in this scenario, over the Jordan River, and the waters were stopped up like the Red Sea. The next point is we're following along in this scenario. The second point was after crossing the Jordan River, which was a type of baptism, cleaning up the children of Israel. It was a prototype. All the males of Israel were circumcised. We read this in Joshua 5 that goes on to explain it. That the crossing of the Jordan was like a baptism, and now all the males were circumcised. In other words, really gets their attention. And Joshua 5 and verse 8, so it was when they finished circumcising all of the people, they stayed in their place in camp until they were healed. And the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. The reproach, the stink that they brought with them from Egypt, because their families had to spend 40 years in the wilderness because they were resistant to what God wanted them to do. And they hadn't been circumcising the males for those years. So the job was done. The nation of Israel then crossed over the Jordan, and the people were cleaned up. They were circumcised. They were being prepared now to move into the promised land. Then, if we read in Joshua 5, verse 10, the people of Israel kept the Passover, just as their parents did when they departed Egypt 40 years before. And it says very clearly, they kept the Passover, those words. So point 4 then, now we have following Passover, which is interesting because this is modeling people after real life. First comes baptism and the keeping of baptism and circumcision. And of course, modernly, as Jesus made it mention, circumcision of the heart. But modernly, we can draw these parallels. And then they kept the first day of unleavened bread on the day after the Passover, which is what their parents and grandparents had to do because they were preparing for a great conflict. They had to travel quickly and lightly and be prepared for war. And this was their first opportunity to eat bread after 40 years of manna. Now, can you imagine how many ways can you cook manna? Just, they collected manna, had to rely on it. So what do we have? Manna cereal for breakfast. What do we have? Manna Crunch, Manna Cheerios. We had Manna Hash. How many ways can you fix manna? I'm sure they had to come up with something creative over the years. But now the manna ceased, and they ate from the local produce. And so so now they were in verse 12. Neither did the children of Israel eat manna anymore. They ate of the fruit of the land. In other words, the food that they found available to them. And then, following, if we look in Joshua 5:13, interesting thing happened. When it came to pass, When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and said, "Are you for us or our adversaries?" Now, I don't know about you, but if I looked up and there's a guy standing with a sword drawn out of its sheath, how many of us would just walk up to him and say, "Are you friend or foe?" Or would you assume that he's drawn the sword for some reason? And I personally might be a little reluctant to just run up and talk to him. And Joshua 5:14, and he said, "Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord, I now come." In other words, he was representing God. And Joshua fell on his face and worshiped and said, "What says my Lord to his servant?" And the captain of the Lord said to Joshua, "Loosen your shoe. The place where you stand is holy." You see, this man, or this person, had a sword. He's called the Lord of hosts. It was the same wording used many years before when Joshua's predecessor Moses was in the presence of God at the burning bush. Take off your shoe. Well, God instructed Joshua that the army of Israel, which would have been about 40,000 armed men, we read that in Joshua 4:13, was to follow instructions to conquer this promised land. In Joshua 6:1, we read that Jericho, the city, was shut up because of the children of Israel. None went in and none came out. So here's a big city. The gates are closed. Now, bear in mind that there's no more business as usual. You got 2 million people out there. Now, I don't know how long it would take to count that many people. But the city knew they were in big trouble. They had the huge mass of people. They know that miracle had just happened. And locally, you see, people in the countryside in the domain of Jericho would have fled to the city for protection. The walls of the city would protect them from invaders, so they went to the city. It's sort of like a feudal system where they went to where the king was for protection behind the city walls. In Joshua 6:2, and the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given into your hand Jericho, the mighty men and the men of valor. It is yours." Well, that sounds a little puzzling, because now bear in mind, the city is all locked up, and then comes an explanation of just how that's going to occur in Joshua 6 and starting in verse 3. And now we have the details. "You shall march around the city, all your men of war. You shall go around the city once. You shall do this for 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the covenant. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times. And the priests shall blow the trumpets, and it shall come to pass that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all of the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him." Yeah, like that's going to happen, right? Walk around the city a few times, blow a horn, and then shout, and the walls fall down? Well, verse 6, "Then Joshua the son of Nun called the priests, and then he explained this to them, what to do." And verse 8, the people, when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets. The ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. So you can just kind of imagine they're circling the city. And they do this, and there are instructions on how to do this. The next point we have on this historical scenario, on this timeline, is that the armed men, the 40,000, as they're marching around the city with the priests, they were to keep quiet for 7 days while they're marching. Now, I don't know that God has ever told me to keep quiet for 7 days. So I don't know that if it's, or expects me to keep quiet for 7 days. But the armed men were to keep quiet for 7 days while marching around the city each day. In Joshua 6, verse 10, "And Joshua commanded the people, saying, You shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall any word proceed out of your mouth until the day I bid you shout. And then you shall shout. Now this has to be an almost unbearable task. Can you imagine being completely quiet for 6 days, 6.5 days or so, almost 7? Now, prisons historically, especially in the French Empire, used silence as a torture device. And the prisoners were severely beaten if they would say anything, if they weren't silent. So how would it be, how much these soldiers, were ready to shout when it came to that 7th day? They had to withhold saying anything. Now, as a teacher for many years, I've had times when students were not supposed to talk. And that is when they're taking tests. And I make it very clear, you can be quiet or you can get a grade of 0. And you choose, be quiet or get the 0. And pretty much uniformly, they choose to be quiet during the test. Because I point out to students that I've already been through high school, I've graduated, and I point out you haven't. So if you want to make it through, you probably want a grade. And then it comes the time when people have all finished the test. And I say, feel free to chat. What do you suppose happens in the room? Do they remain silent? All of a sudden, there's buzzing going on, and they're just really having a grand old time. I mean, you'd think I'd stopped up the Jordan River and it started flowing again. It was really quite remarkable. They were just unleashed. They had restrained themselves for maybe 30, 40 minutes, and now they could chat. So it had to be really a test to be quiet for that long. Next, I want to point out that the number 7 keeps appearing in these instructions on what to do. We have the number of soldiers. When the soldiers marched around the city, they had to keep quiet for 7 days. 7 priests marched around the city with the soldiers for those 7 days, and on the 7th day, they marched around the city 7 times. And on the 7th day, 7 priests were to blow 7 trumpets. Well, I looked in the Teacher's Bible Commentary by Pascal and Hobbes, and they put it this way. The spectacular repetition of the number 7 calls attention to its significance in Scripture. It represents a statement of fulfillment. Anything done 7 times, or multiples of 7, is done just right. And so, in Joshua 6, verse 11, the ark of the Lord compassed the city, going about at once, meaning the priest took it around, and then lodged it in the camp. Verse 12, Joshua rose early in the morning, the priest took up the ark. The priest bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns came before the ark of the Lord and went on continually and blew the trumpets. The armed men went before them, and the reward went behind them, and the priests blowing their trumpets. The 2nd day they encompassed the city once, returned to the camp. So they did 6 days. Verse 15, it came to pass on the 7th day they rose early about the dawning of the day, and compassed about the city in the same manner 7 times. And on that day they compassed the city, and it came to pass, the 7th time they blew the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now, the city is still there. The walls are all right there. Nothing has changed. They just marched around 7 times, and he said, go ahead and shout. Well, the people then shouted. When the priests blew the trumpets, and the people heard the trumpet, they shouted, and then the walls fell down flat, and the people went to the city straight before them, and they took the city. In other words, they took it. It was given to them. They owned everything. So the 7th day marching after Passover, meaning the 7th day of unleavened bread, was the Israelites then took the city. They conquered it. They didn't really have to they just followed God's instructions. They didn't have to do actual battle. God did the battle for them. Now, and it was on this 7th day when the significant event occurred, which would be umpty years ago from this next weekend on the 7th day of unleavened bread. Now, people can remember up to 7 words or 7 numbers, and most of us can remember a 7-digit phone number. Studies will show that if there is a sentence longer than 7 words, most of us have to reread the sentence just to be sure we get the full meaning. And I learned this in law school and writing class. They said, if you want to make it clear, write in sentences of not more than 7 words. If you want to obfuscate your meaning, write in 10 words or more, so that then it has to be interpreted later. And so there are 70 distinct examples in the Bible using hundreds of verses that use the number 7. So I want you right now to buckle your rhetorical seatbelt, and I'm going to go through a list of examples using the term 7. But I'm not going to put scriptures to everyone, or we'd be here for a long time, and I'm too hungry to wait that long. So, 7 days of creation. The 7th-day Sabbath. 7 of each kind of clean animal placed on the ark prior to the flood. It rained 7 days at the outset of the flood. The ark rested in the 7th month, about the time of the Feast of Trumpets. Noah sent doves out from the ark in 7-day intervals. Abraham made an offering of 7 ewe lambs to make peace with Abimelech. Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel and another 7 years because of the trickery. Joseph was called to interpret Pharaoh's dreams about 7 fat cattle and 7 lean cattle. And they consumed 7 fat ears of corn and 7 thin ears of corn. There were 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. 7 days were allocated for the mourning of one's father. Job's friends sat with him without talking for 7 days, just as the Israelites did when they went 7 days without talking while marching around Jericho. The water in Egypt was turned to blood for 7 days. Manna was given 6 days of the week, but not on the 7th day. A Hebrew servant was to be freed in his 7th year. There was a debt release among the Hebrews every 7th year. There were 7 sacrifices during the spring and fall holy days. Every 7th year was designated as a land Sabbath. Every 7 land Sabbaths, or every 50 years, was a Jubilee year. The 10 Commandments were carved on the stone on the 7 days of Moses' time on Mount Sinai. The priests were instructed to make a blood offering for 7 times. King David praised God 7 times each day. In Proverbs 6:16, we read there are 7 things that God hates. We also read that a thief was to restore 7-fold in some circumstances. A new mother was to be isolated for 7 days. Lepers and those with other illnesses were to be isolated and checked by the priest every 7 days. Women were to remain apart from others for 7 days during their female cycle. Warriors were to remain unclean for 7 days following a battle. Warriors fasted for 7 days after retrieving Saul and his sons' bones from the Philistines. Everyone is unclean for 7 days if they touch a dead body, and that what they did with Saul was an example of that. 7 weeks or 7 Sabbaths between unleavened bread and Pentecost. There were 7 lambs to be sacrificed each Pentecost. The Feast of Trumpets is on the 1st day of the 7th month. The Day of Atonement is on the 10th day of the 7th month. The Feast of Tabernacles is for 7 days, starting on the 15th day of the 7th month. We read that Israel was given over to the Midianites to be punished for 7 years. Samson gave his enemies 7 days to answer his riddles. Samson tried to delude Delilah into thinking he could be restrained with 7 ropes. Samson's hair was braided or woven into 7 locks. Naomi's daughter Ruth was said to be better than 7 sons to Naomi. Elisha told Naaman, the Syrian, to bathe in the Jordan River 7 times. Elisha was used by God to resurrect a child who sneezed 7 times when he awakened. There was a famine for 7 years in Elisha's time. Saul was to wait 7 days for Samuel to do a sacrifice. Later, 7 sons of King Saul were hanged for retribution. King David had seven older brothers who were all passed over before the prophet got to David. King David reigned in Hebron for 7 years. David fasted for 7 days during the illness of his son who was born of Bathsheba. King Solomon built the temple in 7 years. After the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus got 7 loaves of bread and distributed them to thousands of people and had 7 baskets left. Christ's admonition to Peter was to forgive others 70 times 7. There were 7 deacons that were then to care for the needs of the church. 7 churches are listed in the book of Revelation. The Revelation talks about 7 candlesticks, 7 stars, 7 lamps, 7 spirits of God, 7 horns, 7 eyes, 7 angels, 7 trumpets, 7 thunders, 7 heads, 7 crowns, 7 last plagues, 7 golden vials, 7 mountains, 7 kings. And we also read that there are 7 utterances spoken by Christ when he was on the cross. You get the idea that the number 7 is important in the plan of God. Well, this preparation is in cleaning up the people of Israel, and the conquering of Jericho was a foretype of what's yet to come in God's 7,000-year plan of salvation for mankind. In Revelation 11:15, we read, "The 7th angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, 'The kingdoms of this world are to become the kingdoms of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever.'" Sounds an awful lot like the Battle of Jericho, when the 7th angel sounded. God's kingdom to earth is coming. We've experienced about 6,000 years of man's inability to govern himself. We have the example now of God's 7-year plan that's being laid out before us. And we're nearing the end of the 6,000-year mark and are on the edge of the beginning of that 7,000th year period, the millennial kingdom of God. And then we'll have a 1,000-year reign of God on the earth that's at hand. Now, we can use this example of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho as an example to clean up our own lives, to circumcise our hearts, to observe the Passover and the Days of Unleavened Bread. So, when someone would ask, well, why are there 7 days of unleavened bread? It seems that God is drumming into our brains the 7-day week as an outline of his plan for his salvation of mankind. The 7th day, Sabbath, pictures the 7,000-year plan of God. The first 6 days, or the first 6,000 years of 6 days of the week, represent 6,000 years where man has demonstrated he's incapable of governing himself, and that man's way leads to misery and death, whereas God's way leads to ultimate peace and happiness. So God's 7,000-year plan is pictured by God's 7 annual holy days. The first annual holy day, which is today, the first day of UB. Then there's the last day of unleavened bread. Following this is 50 days after the Sabbath during the unleavened bread comes the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. Then we have the Feast of Trumpets in the 7th month, the Day of Atonement in the 7th month, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the last great day in the 7th month, 7 annual holy days. The 7-day spring feast of unleavened bread is an annual repetition of God's plan for salvation. And there are 7 days of unleavened bread to remind us of that 7,000-year plan of God. And we need that reminder every year because this is important of responding to God's plan to answer the call in our lives. We have 7 days to remember the fall of Jericho. Jericho was a type of Egypt, a type of Babylon, a symbol of sin. And then we have the example of overcoming that sin. But Jericho stood in the way of Israel inhabiting the promised land. The people of Israel had to be cleaned up in order to possess the promised land, to receive the land of milk and honey. The Israelites were symbolically baptized. They were circumcised. They kept the Passover. They were visited by God through his meeting with Joshua, which was symbolic of receiving the Holy Spirit. And the Israelites kept the 7 days, celebrating the 7 days of unleavened bread. All the while, they kept quiet, refraining from sinning with their mouths. So did the walls of Jericho fall down because 40,000 armed Israelites surrounded the walls and appeared threatening to the people of Jericho? No. No, the walls fell down because the people of Israel had enough faith to follow the instructions that God had given to Joshua. The people cleaned up their lives, and God then gave them the promised land. So let's personalize the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Today in our own lives, every one of us is facing our own looming battle of Jericho. Each one of us has obstacles before us, between us and inheriting eternal life. Each one of us is facing our own view of the promised land. Each one of us has to clean up our lives and have the faith that God will help us overcome the Jericho that lies ahead of us, which is the sin in our lives that we must put out. Now, in Jericho, the Canaanite woman Rahab and her family decided to clean up their lives and abandon Jericho in that sense and join the Israel of God. So what is the city of Jericho like in our lives? What's standing between us and the promised land that our eternal God has offered to us? Well, God has offered this opportunity to clean up our lives. We have an opportunity for baptism. The opportunity for the circumcision of our heart to be truly converted, to receive the Holy Spirit, to do what God says each week, and then every day, not just during the week of unleavened bread. So what are the lessons that lead up to the Battle of Jericho that coincide with Passover and the Days of Unleavened Bread? There are 7 lessons we can gather from this history in the book of Joshua. First, the people of Israel were symbolically baptized by the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River at flood stage, just like the miracles that God allowed their parents to cross the Red Sea when leaving Egypt. The second lesson is after crossing the Jordan River, all the males were circumcised. Number 3, the children of Israel kept the Passover just as their parents did prior to departing Egypt 40 years before. Number 4, the children of Israel ate unleavened bread for 7 days, as their parents did when they left Egypt. Number 5, God instructed Joshua just as he had instructed Moses years before, and just as he instructs each one of us today through his word, which we have called the Holy Scriptures, the Bible. Number 6, the army of Israel kept quiet for 7 days as they marched around the city each day. They didn't sin with their lips. And number 7 lesson, 7 priests blew the ram's horn 7 times on the 7th day when they marched around the city 7 times, and then the people shouted, and the walls of the city fell down, and Israel moved in to possess the long-promised land. God has given us the coming anniversary of the fall of Jericho and the preceding 7-day week of unleavened bread, that we may remember God's 7,000-year plan, and we might have faith and overcome our own personal obstacles to join God in his kingdom. I'd like this to be a closing verse in Hebrews 11, verse 30. In Hebrews 11, verse 30. It says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about for 7 days. It doesn't say here that the 40,000 Israelite armed soldiers overwhelmed the city, climbed the walls, killed all the people, and so forth. They had to prepare to do so, but the walls fell down by faith. They were doing what God said. So let's fully embrace the celebration of 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that these annual holy days show that God is welcoming us into his family. And it's up to us to embrace our faith in God and his plan, and we must show our appreciation using desire, relief, and rejoicing.